All right, everybody. I hope you're all having a swell day. And thank you to Xander for hosting, and thank you to the Forest Stewards Guild, and also Barb Satink-Wolfson was at the Southwest Fire Science Consortium was great in advertising and promoting this webinar. So thanks to you both. And just a little background on myself. I do work at this little entity called the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and that's part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And for those of you that don't know, the Forest Service has a research and development branch. And so I am part of that, and that's what we do. We do, research and development. And so at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, we do a lot of work on fire, and it's been a lot of fun. And in particular, done a lot of work on fire in wilderness and looking at fire as a natural process. And I guess Xander mentioned all this, so I don't need to get into it. But I do also want to acknowledge my collaborators who are listed at the bottom left here. We've got Lisa Holsinger, who works with me at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and Matt Panuto, who is formerly of the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, but has moved on to BLM in Utah, I believe. And we've got Matt Jolly and Greg Dillon from the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, and Solomon Dabrowski from University of Montana. And in particular, Lisa and Matt Panuto were pretty key in this entire process because of the amount of data that was necessary and the amount of processing on the cloud and using Google Earth Engine and what have you. And so I just do want to give them a special shout out. I don't know if this qualifies technically as big data, but to me, it does. The amount of data that went into this and the amount of processing that went into this personally is a kind of a big data thing. So again, with Lisa and Matt Panuto, it's important to have their collaboration on this. So I do want to say that this study was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program under a larger project titled Quantifying the Risk of Fire-Facilitated Transition to Non-Forest in California and the Southwest. So what I'm going to be talking about today is one of three components of this larger JFSP funded study. And the idea here is, this talk I'm talking about, this talk today is about stand replacing fire or high severity fire. And so the idea here is without stand replacing fire, we actually don't see any fire facilitated conversions to non-forest. So if we're thinking about fire facilitated conversion, we need to have that catalyst, which is a high severity fire, to drive that. So if you have a low severity fire, you won't see that. So that's where high severity fire fits in with this broader JFSP funded study. And you'll also note that as I go through this presentation that we have moved, for this component of the project, we moved beyond California and the Southwest to a big chunk of the Western US. So we had two goals for this project. And the first was to identify what are the key drivers that control high severity fire. And the second goal was to produce wall-to-wall maps that depict the probability of stand replacing fire. So, give us a geospatial depiction of where we think stand replacing fire is likely to occur on the landscape. And to achieve these goals, we basically needed to produce some good models. We needed good models that describe and explain high severity fire. And that's a big chunk of my talk today. And in terms of the second goal, these wall-to-wall maps, the idea here is that when we look out on the landscape, we do see a lot of variability in fire effects. We see green chunks, we see brown and gray chunks, and we see black chunks, and everything in between. So there's a lot of heterogeneity and variability in terms of fire effects and fire severity. So, the idea here of making these mapped predictions is that we thought it would be pretty cool if we could have an idea of how a site would burn before it actually did burn. So that's the second objective here. And as we initiated this modeling, we started thinking about basically what drives fire severity. And so, one way to think about it is what drives fire behavior. And a lot of you have seen this fire behavior triangle, where fire behavior is influenced by fuel, topography, and weather. And, you know, in this context, fire behavior could be considered, say, flame length or, you know, the rate of spread of a fire. However, you know, it's important to think when we're talking about fire behavior does not always equal fire effects. And when I talk about fire effects, I mean, I use the term fire severity and fire effects kind of synonymous, you know, interchangeably. But, you know, when I'm talking about fire severity or fire effects, I'm talking about the ecological response to fire, okay? So fire behavior does not necessarily equal fire effects. And there's, you know, a 3-foot flame length, for example, might have different fire effects depending on the species that are present on a site. You know, if you think about colder and wetter climates, for example, they might have species that are more sensitive to fire, like spruce fir forests and lodgepole pine forests. They've got thinner bark, they've got shallower roots. However, warmer and drier climates might have, you know, tree species that are more resilient to fire. The classic example, of course, being ponderosa pine. So basically, because different tree species have different resistance traits to fire, that fire severity, we also have to start thinking about what's, you know, fire severity does not equate to fire behavior. And so what we did here is we added climate into this sucker. So basically we're considering climate as an indirect proxy for other factors that may drive fire severity, you know, such as forest type or dominant species. So I'm kind of thinking we might need a new shape here. So, you know, okay, wait for it. Here it is. The fire effects rhombus. I look forward to hearing your feedback about this super innovative idea. Maybe later. Anyway, we modeled fire severity for 19 different ecoregions in the Western US. And each of these ecoregions does have a separate model. And, you know, the reason is that you might expect that the drivers of high severity fire may be different on the California coast compared to, say, the southwestern US, or compared to the Northern Rockies, or compared to the Pacific Northwest. So because there's potentially different drivers that vary geographically, we have a different model for each ecoregion. I want to point out that our model is only applicable to forest types, and we didn't deal with shrub and grassland here at all. So remember that as I move forward. So we modeled fire severity as a function of these 4 groups of variables: fuels, topography, climate, and weather. Each of these factors actually has several variables that were evaluated for inclusion into these models. So when we're talking about fuels, basically I'm thinking about, or we used the satellite representation of pre-fire fuel. These have funny names, but some of you are familiar with the normalized difference vegetation index, or the normalized difference moisture index, or the enhanced vegetation index. So these are all pre-fire views of fuel according to the Landsat satellite imagery, which has a 30-meter spatial resolution. In topography, we evaluated 4 variables in terms of topography. The topographic position index, that's an index of, say, ridgetop versus valley bottom. And then we looked at slope. Everyone knows, you know, what slope is. And then we also evaluated solar radiation, which, with the idea that, you know, south-facing aspects are going to be warmer and have a lot of solar radiation compared to north-facing aspects, which are going to be cooler. And then lastly, we looked at the dissection index, which is a measure of basically topographic ruggedness or topographic variability. The third factor we looked at here is this idea of climate. And here, just to make it clear, this is not, you know, annual climate or climate variability. These are 30-year normals that represent spatial variability in climate. So we've got that climatic moisture deficit, evapotranspiration, and mean summer temperature. Here's just some maps of them so you have an idea of what it looks like. So the climate inputs, they're the average over a 1981 to 2010 time period. And, remember this is, more or less an indirect proxy for vegetation type or species composition, or, major species. So you can, look at these maps and you can kind of think about how fire resistance traits might partition themselves along these different climatic gradients. And the last factor we looked at here was this idea of weather. We looked at daily weather, such as daily burning index, daily temperature, and daily energy release component. We also looked at year of fire weather. So this does look at annual variability in climate or weather, including year of fire temperature, year of fire climatic moisture deficit, and year of fire heat moisture index. So heat moisture index basically integrates precipitation and temperature. So I'm going to show you what some of these inputs look like, and basically I'm going to show you what their maps look like, and also describe them in a little more detail. But I'll start with the dependent variable, which is fire severity. Okay, so fire severity was itself measured with pre and post-fire satellite imagery. We acquired the imagery from the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity program, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Using that imagery, we calculated or produced a fire severity metric called the relativized burn ratio. And this metric, just like other indices that you may be familiar with, such as DNBR and RDNBR, it has a strong relationship to field-based measures of fire severity. So the relativized burn ratio, as these other metrics are as well, it's a continuous metric, but it's basically dimensionless. It has a bunch of values that don't mean much themselves. And that's why what we did is we reclassified that continuous relativized burn ratio into two classes representing either high severity or other severity. And we based it on a threshold in the relativized burn ratio that was a threshold that was identified in a previous study. That threshold corresponds to about 90 to 95% tree mortality. And so that would be the definition of high severity fire. That corresponds to about that tree mortality percentage. And in these models, we looked at all large fires from 2002 to 2015, and that's a lot of fires. That's over 2,000 fires when it's all said and done. So I do want to show you some maps of what some of these other variables look like. Again, here's fire severity. This is for one fire, a fire that occurred in 2011 in New Mexico called the Miller Fire. Occurred in the Gila Wilderness, for those of you that are, want to know. So even though we're showing a continuous representation of severity here in this map, this severity map and the severity maps for each of the 2,000 fires were all, they're all categorized into these binary classes that represent high severity and not high severity. Here's a couple examples of the pre-fire fuels. So we've got the normalized differenced vegetation index and the normalized differenced moisture index. Here's a couple examples of the topographic variables we use. We've got the topographic position index, again, kind of valley bottom versus ridge top. And then we've got potential solar radiation, which accounts for, aspect differences in its relation to the sun angle. And then lastly here, well, not lastly, but next we have climate. We've got the climatic moisture deficit and mean summertime temperature. And remember, I showed these maps earlier for the entire lower 48. Here's these maps just clipped to this individual fire. So the last group we look at is fire weather. And I want to touch on how we were able to incorporate daily fire weather, because this is one of those super data intensive processes that was challenging yet kind of fun to get it working. But basically there's another satellite out there called MODIS, and the MODIS satellite, it measures a lot of, like, hundreds or thousands of things on the Earth's surface, but one thing it measures is fires, and it basically looks for actively burning pixels. And when it finds an actively actively burning pixel, it records the location and the date. This satellite or this sensor passes overhead 4 times per day. So we get a lot of information about when and where pixels burned. From there, what we did is we spatially interpolated those MODIS maps, those dots on the left, to produce fire progression maps. And you can see that on the right over here. Okay, so that's a fire progression map for some fire. I don't even know which one, but we were able to build these fire progression maps for each of over 2,000 fires. So within each of these fires, within each fire, we know the date that it burned. And if we know the date that it burned within each of those fires, we can intersect it with gridded daily weather products that are out in the world. So here's an example of some gridded daily weather products, the energy release component from June 1st to June 15th and June 30th of 2011. These maps are from Matt Jolly at the Fire Lab. And we have these maps going all the way back to 2002, which is when our fire record starts. I believe these maps do go back prior to that, but we didn't use them. So just to make this super duper clear, say here's a fire progression we built for the Miller fire again that burned in 2011. And the purples they show us where the fire started and where it initially spread to, and the greens show us, the later dates of the fire and where it was extinguished. And I'm going to show here one date, and that's May 8, 2011, the black area. So we can take that black area and we can intersect it with the daily map of energy release component and also daily burning index and also daily temperature. And so we can do this for every day of every fire. So we end up with a lot of information, even within individual fires, because each individual fire, different parts of it burn under different burning conditions. And that's what we're trying to get at. And that's what we attempted to get at. So we also looked at year of fire weather in addition to daily fire weather. So again, that was the heat moisture index, temperature, and the climatic moisture deficit. And this basically tells us if the year in which the fire burned was warmer than average or cooler than average. You might imagine that that fire severity might be higher in a year that's warmer than average, or it might be higher in a year that's drier than average. So these year of fire variables give us that information. So our weather variables encompass 2 temporal scales. One is the daily scale, and one is the year of fire or annual scale. So when it's all said and done, we evaluated a total of 16 variables in each ecoregional model. And so what this means is that we have maps of each of these 16 variables for each fire. And again, I do want to just show these examples. And the point of showing these examples is that I want to make it really clear. Sometimes when I've talked about this, people think that the fire is the unit of analysis, where it's either a high severity fire or it's a low severity fire. And I want to make it clear that we're actually looking at within the variability within each fire. So we sample every pixel within each of these 2,000 fires. And when we sample each pixel, we get the information on the fire severity and all 16 of those explanatory variables. Okay, so what we end up with is hundreds of thousands of pixels in each ecoregion to analyze, or that go into our models. So, and note at the bottom right, I just have day of burning. It's because from day of burning, we can get the daily ERC and the daily burning index and the daily temperature. So again, what we end up with is hundreds of thousands of records or pixels in each ecoregion for our models. So in modeling fire severity as a function of fuels, topography, climate, and fire weather, we used statistical or a machine learning class of models called boosted regression trees. I'm not going to get too much into that, but it's for those of you who have heard of machine learning, random forest is a machine learning model as well. So it's in the same class of models as random forest. And when I'm talking about cross-validated variable selection here, what this means is that we eliminated variables from the model if they did not improve the quality of the model. So the cross-validation it was pretty intense, but basically we had to go through each variable and decide if it was an important variable or not. And if they were not variable, we got rid of them. So in the end, when it was all said and done, each ecoregional model generally had a lot fewer variables than those initial 16 that we looked at. And then in terms of cross-validated model validation, that seems redundant now that I read it. What this means is that we built our models using a subset of fires, and then we tested out that model on a different subset of fires that was not used to build the model. So it was a completely independent testing data set. And this gives us what I consider a really honest assessment of the quality of the model. If you don't do that, if you don't do this cross-validated approach, in my mind, we would be inflating the validation statistics. And I wanted to be, honest with myself and what have you, and with everyone else about how well these models perform. And so we did this cross-validated approach. So if you remember, the first goal of the study was to identify the most important variables that drive standard placing fire. And this is what our results show. This is called what we call the relative influence. And it is an interpretation here. All values add up. All these percentages add up to 100%. So, and these values are averaged across all the ecoregions, all the 19 ecoregions. So on average, so as interpretation here, on average, pre-fire fuels, as measured by the satellite, was responsible for over 50% in the variation in fire severity in the Western US. And I do want to point out that there is substantial variation among ecoregions in these relative importance values. So if you want to check out that, per ecoregion, I recommend you go to the paper that was recently published on this topic. But these values do reflect the average of each of these factors over the Western US. So two things to point out here. One is that, fuels and fire weather are on average the two most influential factors. They account for about 75% of the variability in fire severity on average. And the other thing that was kind of interesting here, I thought, was that topography was the least influential factor on average. And the reason why this is interesting is because a lot of other studies out there have shown that topography was either the most important or was, really highly influential. So what's up with that, So for example, I'm showing Greg Dillon's paper here, and Greg Dillon here in this paper showed that topography and climate were the major drivers of fire severity. So the question, arises, why would the results of this study that I'm highlighting today be so different from, say, the Dillon et al. Study and others? So there's two things that pop out in my mind. And one of them is that if you don't evaluate fuels, you're not going to find fuels as being important, right? So this study highlighted here, or shown here by Greg Dillon, they looked at topography and climate. So topography and climate were the most important variables. So yeah, if you don't look at something, you're not going to find it, right? So, and number two, in this paper by Greg Dillon, he and his colleagues did suggest that topography was indirectly measuring something else. And they thought that something else was fuel moisture and fuel amount. So again, Greg Dillon and colleagues suggested that topography was indirectly measuring fuel moisture and fuel amount. And so we totally agree with that. And we also think since we directly measured fuel with the satellites, we're basically getting a different representation of the relative influence of topography. And so that's probably why the results are so different from, our results are so different from Greg Dillon's and other studies out there. So, topography clearly should be important in some cases, right? I can envision, say, a fire that's moving up a steep slope and it's preheating the fuels, and you might it might result in a higher severity fire compared to a fire that's backing down a steep slope, right? So the slope is exactly the same, but you might actually get different fire effects depending on the direction of fire spread. So topography probably is important, but it's conditional on which way the fire is spreading, which we did not and pretty much cannot incorporate into these models at this time. So I do want to talk about our validation statistics. Again, this is a cross-validated approach here. And what we did is we calculated the AUC. AUC stands for the area under the curve. And it's an appropriate validation statistic when you're looking at models with a binary response. And we looked at, we have models with a binary response, right? The response is either it's a high severity fire or it's not a high severity fire. And generally speaking, AUC values greater than 0.7 are considered decent models according to the literature, and AUC values below 0.7 are considered, you know, for lack of a better term, subpar models. So I'm showing here a map of the cross-validated AUCs for the different ecoregions. And so you can note that several ecoregions that actually did not meet that threshold of 0.7. It turns out that 13 of those ecoregions did meet that threshold. So 13 of those ecoregions have a cross-validated AUC of at least 0.7, and those are listed in bold on the right. So I do want to mention here the difficulty in why it is difficult to model severity and why some of these AUCs are, low or subpar. Number one, I alluded to earlier, thinking about the direction of fire spread. A heading fire, where the fire is heading is going to have a, it's going to be more intense and therefore have more fire effects and higher severity fire compared to a backing fire. So these are things that we can't account for. So you can have a pixel out on the landscape that has the exact same fuels, has the exact same slope, and has the exact same everything, but the severity or effects of that fire are going to be different depending on the direction of fire spread. So again, that's just something that we can't really get at, and it makes it difficult to model fire severity. The next is the idea that fire weather does occur at spatial and temporal scales that we did not measure or even can't measure. We had this the daily and the year of fire weather, but there are things going out there at finer spatial and temporal scales that that are, I think, more or less impossible to get at. And then the idea that fire can create its own weather. I mean, we'll never be able to figure that one out. I mean, from this modeling standpoint that I'm creating here, that I'm showing off here, that one's going to be hard. This idea that fires create their own weather did get a lot of attention this year due to the Carr fire and the fire tornado that was involved with the Carr fire. So that makes it difficult. And then, the satellites do have a hard time, or maybe it's impossible to characterize dead and surface fuels with the satellite imagery that we have. In theory, it could be done with plots or LiDAR over smaller spatial scales. But when we're talking about these large ecoregions and doing analyses over the entire Western US, it seems like it would be difficult to characterize these types of fuels. And also, fuel structure too, and forest structure. And the idea of ladder fuels are hard to get at with the satellite imagery. So I want to move on. That was my talk about modeling the high severity fire. Now I want to talk about the predictions of high severity fire. So when we predict high severity fire, it turns out that when you have maps of all those input variables, which we have, it's actually rather straightforward to produce maps depicting the probability of standard placing fire. We basically use the maps, we use our model and the data from maps to make new predictions. So here, and I'm showing you fuels data, I'm showing you fuels data from 2016 that we obtained from Google Earth Engine. So we've got normalized difference vegetation index, the enhanced vegetation index, and normalized difference moisture index. And so when we plug these into the model and we get predictions, the predictions are relevant for fuels data as of 2016. So the severity predictions are fairly up to date. So again, just maps of our inputs. These are the climate inputs. Here's the maps of the topographic inputs for the Southern Rockies ecoregion. And these are the variables that were selected by the model I talked about earlier about that we used cross-validated model selection or cross-validated variable selection. So not all 4 topographic inputs were deemed appropriate for the Southern Rockies ecoregion. So that's why we're missing a topographic position index here. And the last input here is fire weather. And it might seem kind of strange that these are blank, but these are the 3 fire weather variables that the Southern Rockies, that were selected in the Southern Rockies model. And here's why they're blank. So remember that I said earlier, each ecoregion has hundreds of thousands of pixels or observations. Okay, each of those observations has its own daily and year of fire weather. So we need to incorporate the variability in fire weather as we build these predictions. So what we did is, of those hundreds of thousands of observations, we randomly selected 100 records, and each record has its own daily and year of fire weather. And we then made 100 predictions for each ecoregion, and each of those predictions represents an observed weather observation. So here's some examples of, this is not 100 predictions, this is 20 predictions for the Canadian Rockies ecoregion. And remember, each of these is under a different weather observation. So in the paper, we call these the 100 initial predictions. We took these 100 initial predictions, and then we calculated a per pixel mean. A per pixel mean over those 100 predictions to come up with our final predictions. And that's what this looks like here. So for the Canadian Rockies and Southern Rockies ecoregion, these are maps of the probability of high severity fire, and it's the mean prediction over those 100 initial predictions. I do want to emphasize here that these predictions of high severity fire, they are contingent upon a fire actually occurring. Okay, so that's why it's the probability of high severity fire or a fire to actually occur. It actually says nothing about the likelihood of overall fire. You can have areas that have a very high likelihood of fire or a very low likelihood of fire. These maps don't care about that. These maps say, if there is a fire, this is what we think the probability of high severity fire is. So, unfortunately, we did not produce these maps for all ecoregions. I mentioned earlier before about that AUC threshold of 0.7. Basically, our validation statistics basically said some of our models were not that great. If our models were not great, I did not want to produce maps of standard placing fire or high severity fire. I could have, but I chose not to because I thought that that would be a little misleading, or there was a potential for misuse or what have you. But basically, if we're not producing a good model, I don't think we should be producing maps. So, so for these 13 ecoregions that have circles around them and are in bold, we have predictions of high severity fire. I'm going to show in a couple minutes where to get those if you're interested. For a subset of ecoregions, we also produced predictions under extreme fire weather, and there's extreme fire weather and moderate fire weather. Okay, and the reason why this is for a subset of ecoregions, we only produced these predictions under moderate and extreme fire weather if the relative influence of weather was at least 15%. And the idea here is, if our models show that weather is not that important, it's probably really inappropriate to have models under moderate and extreme fire weather because our models show weather is not important. So anyway, we produced these additional predictions for, I believe, 6 ecoregions. I'll show those in a moment, under the idea of moderate fire weather and extreme fire weather. To produce those, we took those 100 initial predictions that I talked about earlier. Remember, each of those predictions was under some randomly selected weather observation. And for each pixel, we drilled down for each pixel through each of those observations, or for each of those initial predictions, and found the 50th percentile prediction and the 95th percentile prediction. So for the 50th percentile prediction, we interpret that to represent moderate fire weather. And for the 95th percentile prediction, we interpret that to represent extreme fire weather. So the ecoregions here with double circles are those 6 ecoregions for which we built those additional predictions under moderate and extreme fire weather. So I know you all want to go out and download and find this information like right now. So here's how you do it. We have got everything available on the Frames website. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Frames. I do want to give a big shout out to Diana Olson and Mike Tolker at University of Idaho. They are Frames folks, and they were integral, or they were very helpful in getting these maps up online. So if you go to this website, there's links at the bottom where you just click on the link, and it downloads a zip file that has all the predictions in it. I really also think it's important to point out the banner at the top. I don't know if you'll note, but there's some really cool Back to the Future font up there. Yeah, pretty cool. It turns out that you can actually get a Back to the Future font from Microsoft products. So if you want a Back to the Future font, you can get it and use it in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or whatever. So it's pretty awesome. And I did make a couple figures that I was hoping to go on the website that didn't make the cut. Here's one, again, with the Back to the Future theme. Make sure you check out the license plate. That's, important. And there's Michael J. Fox, looking pretty cool. Unfortunately, there were some issues or concerns with copyright infringement, so these figures or images didn't quite make it onto the website. But I was disappointed, but I understand. But anyway, let's get back to the science here. I want to just throw out the idea here. I'm kind of wondering if these models and the predictions could be used as a performance metric for evaluating field treatments. So I mentioned earlier that we made our predictions using 2016 imagery. It turns out we could use any era imagery, well, any Landsat era imagery, and plug it into the model and make these predictions. So this map on the top shows a prediction using imagery from 2007. And the map on the bottom shows a prediction of standard placing fire from 2011. And sometime between 2007 and 2011, field treatments were implemented in this area. And you can see those by the black polygon. And what you see, is what's fairly obvious is that between those two time periods, the pre-treatment prediction and the post-treatment prediction, within the treatment units, there's a fairly substantial reduction in the probability of standard placing fire. So I don't know the answer whether or not this data product and models can be used for evaluating field treatments. I think it's worth thinking about and perhaps, conducting a study to try to figure out, how well it works. I do want to talk about interpreting these mapped predictions, because, when you put out products like those that are on the Frames website and that we developed in the study, I do worry about the potential that these could be accidentally or even purposely misused. So I do want to just put out some caveats, some do's and don'ts of using these mapped predictions. So the first is just the idea that remember that modeling fire severity is difficult. The models are imperfect, and so the predictions are going to be imperfect. There's some degree of uncertainty that you need to acknowledge when using these products, and I talked about the difficulties in modeling fire severity earlier, like the direction of fire spread and, the difficulty in incorporating weather and dead and surface fuels and forest structure and whatnot. And I mentioned this earlier, but just remember that these map probabilities are conditional on a fire actually burning a pixel. Doesn't mean fire has burned this pixel, although I'm sure fires have burned all these pixels at some point in the past. But anyway, these predictions are conditional on a fire actually occurring. And then also, do not ever, ever, ever compare severity predictions among ecoregions. It's strongly discouraged and is definitely not appropriate. And then lastly, and this one's a little difficult to get across, but the probability should not be strictly interpreted based on this range of 0 to 1. I mean, they do range from 0 to 1, but a pixel with a 0.5 probability does not have a 50% chance of burning at high severity. And the reason why this is basically because of the input data that goes into it. For most ecoregions, we have well less than 50% of the records burn at high severity. So when you build these models, what we end up with is basically a skewed distribution. So a lot of the probabilities are skewed low. Okay, so proper interpretation is basically a pixel with a 0.5 probability of high severity fire is higher than a pixel with 0.4 probability. That's higher than a pixel with 0.3 probability. But strictly interpreting those as like, the percent chance of burning at high severity is not appropriate. So I do want to point out that what I'm presenting here has been published in this paper here. So if you want to know some of the really nitty-gritty details about what we did and why we did it, you can check out that paper. And then another thing that's come up before is people want to know why or what's different about our products compared to some other products out there that also have maps depicting the probability of high severity fire. And one of those other products is called FireSev. And FireSev is led by Greg Dillon at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, who's also, an author and collaborator of the effort I'm showing here. But I want to briefly just kind of go over some of the key differences just so you have an idea. Number one is that, we've used kind of more up-to-date fuels. So 2016 versus 2011, that's not really a huge difference, but it is something to think about. Also, in terms of fuels inputs, we use Landsat, which is a fairly fine resolution. And FireSev used a coarser resolution fuel input. They used MODIS, which is either at 250 or 500 meters. I'm not sure which. The FireSev predictions are still at 30 meters, as are same with ours, but the fuels inputs for those were coarser resolution. Also, in terms of fuel inputs, is the idea that we're trying to develop our product so that it is updatable. I mentioned earlier that we can plug and play, we can plug into any circa Landsat data into our models and make a prediction. And there's asterisks here because it turns out that the FireSev product is actually updatable because they could get new MODIS data and make new predictions. But I talked to Greg Dillon about this, and he says they don't really have plans to do that. So that's why there's an asterisk there. But just as an example, the Gila National Forest asked me to update a prediction for their forest. So we went out and got 2018 imagery from Google Earth Engine and produced an updated fire severity, or updated prediction of the probability of high severity fire, and that's it for a portion of the Gila National Forest. What else is different here? Well, we've got different weather inputs. We use multiple weather variables, including daily weather. FireSev has one weather variable, 1,000-hour fuel moisture, which is actually averaged. It's an average of 10 days after each fire starts. And then what else is different here? The predictions. Okay, we predict high severity fire for only select ecoregions and only for forested pixels. Whereas FireSev has predictions for all of the lower 48. I am only showing their Western US map here, but they recently produced maps for the Eastern US. So FireSev does have maps for the entire lower 48, and they have different products for forest and non-forest. So that's a pretty important difference right there. And also, we do have predictions under different weather scenarios, but that's only for some of those ecoregions, those 5 or 6 ecoregions. But FireSev has one prediction that basically represents the 95th percentile 1,000-hour fuel moisture. So when you're doing stuff like building these models, or whenever I kind of wrap up and concluding and doing talks like this, I always think about, if I were to do it again, what would I do differently? So that's what I'm thinking about. And I actually do want to do it again, and I do want to do it differently. And what I want to do is build better models. And that sounds, oh, of course everyone wants better models, right? But I've actually got some what I think are concrete ideas to improve the models. You know, I actually got a phone call recently, or an email actually, from a Forest Service employee at the regional office in California. That's region 5. And he kind of seemed a little disappointed that I didn't have maps for the Klamath and Sierra Nevada ecoregions. And again, I said I didn't want to build maps because of the model quality. But I'm pretty sure I can build better maps for those ecoregions and all the other ecoregions. I've actually done some initial tests, and I'm pretty darn confident I can include, or I can improve those models, including those ecoregions that had that that AUC value, that validation statistic that was considered subpar. I think it would be also great if we could build some capacity for automatically updating these predictions, and maybe not automatically, that's the wrong word, but you know, have a dedicated person whose job it is to, you know, rerun the models with the updated imagery and put them online so we can have annual updates up there. So those would be the next steps, you know, if you know, side funding and all that. Anyway, I want to do a quick data call for an unrelated project before I wrap up here. I'm involved with another project that is going to be using Google Earth Engine to make some pretty cool fire severity maps out in the world. And what we need to make this work is composite burn index data sets. And we're hoping to span the entire North American continent. So if you have any composite burn index data sets, please contact me and see if you know, let me know if you're willing to contribute them. And what this is, it's basically just a version 2 of this project, or this project here that's shown below. It's a recently published paper in which we produced a tool to compute fire severity metrics using Google Earth Engine. So we want to, you know, improve this tool, and we've got some great ideas, but we need composite burn index data to do that. We need a lot of it. So anyway, I'm going to end right there and call her good.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. Excellent presentation, and some of that I'd gotten to see before, but I definitely, it's detailed enough that I certainly learned new stuff. So I thank you for walking through it all. And this presentation will be recorded, so if you're like me and need to hear it maybe more than once, you'll get a link to the recording as a registrant. And you can also share that with people who weren't able to join us today. So we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I did want to spend a little time for questions and answers now. And I think some of those are coming in. So yeah, feel free to just type them right into the chat window. The first one comes in from Sarah, and she asks you, Sean, when looking for an AUC of greater than 0.7, can you see the spatial distribution of AUC to determine if there are certain subregions that do or do not work with this model? And so she's thinking particularly of the Sierra Nevada.
That's a really good question, and I think that if I were to do this again, that would be a good idea. I haven't done that, but I did think about it, but just didn't do it. I think that it'll work better as we get more fire data into these models. Right now, there's only, what, 13 or 14 years of fire data, so sometimes some ecoregions don't even have a good spatial representation of where the fires are. You know, the Sierra Nevada, for example, might be skewed. You know, there might be more fires north or south or in the central Sierra Nevada. I don't actually even know, but it's a good idea. In the future, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think it also points to a better understanding of how that AUC works. So even asking the question kind of helps me think about it. While we're waiting for other questions to come into the chat window, I thought one of the more important slides you had, Sean, was sort of the caveats or what not to do with the data. And as somebody who is more likely to just use the data than, you know, analyze it or something, I guess I would be curious if you could maybe reiterate your point about comparing fire severity between ecoregions, and sort of explain a little bit why that's a big no-no.
Okay, well, there's two reasons why that's a big no-no. First of all, the models for each ecoregion are different. You know, they have different variables that were selected as the important variables, and they have different. They potentially have different relationships to fire severity. So that's one reason. But probably the more important one is what I don't want you to say that, oh, ecoregion X has more area that's high severity fire compared to ecoregion Y, and that gets back to this idea that that these probabilities shouldn't strictly be measured on this 0 to 1 scale, because if most of the data that went into ecoregion X, you know, was say like 20% of it was considered high severity pixels, in ecoregion Y, say 50% of those are high severity pixels. Those results from those different ecoregions are going to have different mean predictions just based on that input data itself. So, because it's based on the prevalence of high severity fire in that initial data set. So that would be why that's inappropriate.
Okay,
so
thank you.
That makes
sense. Yep. And I guess I also, following up on that, had a question about how to explain the probability numbers. So you made the point that a 0.5 is not a 50% chance of burning at high severity. It is higher than a 0.4 and lower than a 0.6. And I wondered if in displaying the data, even for sort of the general public, if using sort of a gradient of like very high likelihood to very low likelihood, or some other, if there was sort of phrasings or wordings that you would feel more comfortable with to get away from that sort of percentage idea.
Right. Well, in all the maps I showed, I didn't actually put percentages on there. I just showed a gradient from high to low. So if you don't associate specific values with that, that might be appropriate. The other thing I've done with all my maps is all the maps that I've showed and show in the publication, I divide into, how to say this? Basically, each color has the exact same number of pixels. So, you know, basically you can lie with maps depending on how you skew the colors and what have you. So I tried not to do that. You kind of have to play around. I don't have a good suggestion for that, but you kind of have to play around with the best way to do your legend. But I think not assigning it actual values is a good idea, and maybe just calling it a relative probability.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions? I guess Carson has a question or comment. After realizing the importance of fuel characteristics to the models created, were there ideas about how to improve the data used or underlying data within this category to then improve future models, future predictions?
Right. I do. Yeah. I've been thinking about using some other spectral information that might get at some other fuels characteristics. Like I was thinking, for example, there's something called like the normalized difference senescence index. And I was wondering if that would maybe get it better at dead fuel. But I don't know right off the bat about some of that, but I think that some more work could be done looking at some of the other spectral indices out there that might get other fuel characteristics. I don't have a clear idea what those are at this specific time.
Good. Definitely a sort of thinking about improvements on into future years. Job security, perhaps. Well, we're a little bit over time here, so we should probably wrap up. But Sean, I want to thank you again. I think this is a great presentation, and I'm looking forward to using the data. So thank you for explaining it and also making it available. And thanks everybody to participating. It was great to have so many people on the line, and I hope you will join us for future webinars.
Yeah. Thanks, Xander, and thanks everyone else for attending.
Great. I'll close it down now. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Toodles.